Hey, Cypher here. I decided to record this lecture from my American history courses and do all the fancy audio work I've done in the past. It's meant for an intro-level college class. I actually give it in both halves, one at the end and another at the beginning, since they divide these courses by Reconstruction. Hopefully you'll find it enlightening. Thanks to all my patrons, especially Kevin Butler, for making this happen. From the midst of the Civil War until 1877, the U.S. attempted to reconstruct itself from the most destructive war in our history. Great questions had to be answered over what the Civil War ultimately meant. The South had seceded in order to maintain the institution of slavery, and though the Union had initially fought to preserve the fragile Constitution, that cause eventually morphed into one of abolition. Dealing with all of these newly freed slaves, and how to weave them into American society, constituted nothing less than a revolution. But that revolution remained unfinished. In a noble attempt to implement civil rights and redefine the role of race in America, citizens grew tired of the tumult, and by 1877 Reconstruction ended in a dismal backroom deal, simply so that the ruling party could remain in control of federal power. The North may have won the Civil War, but the South won Reconstruction. The very definition of Reconstruction and what it meant was always contested. Historians to this day still argue over its meaning. The first and most obvious of these is post-war rehabilitation, as in rehabilitating Southerners from rebellion all the way back to the citizenship which they had renounced by betraying their country. There was, of course, also concerns over economic recovery. The economy of the North wore down because of the war, and Southern infrastructure faced utter destruction as a repercussion for their insurrection. Some congressmen even called on punishing the South, using military occupation to cause even greater harm than the war itself. Though this never came to be, many Southerners will pretend that that is in fact what Reconstruction was, which is a constitutive part of a mythology they created after the war called the Lost Cause. An ideology which would build up over the course of Reconstruction as a way to memorialize Southerners' rebellion and deny the ignoble ends for which they fought. But Reconstruction was not so easily defined. In fact, many historians debate over its geographical location. For the most part, when we speak of Reconstruction, we are referring to southern states, specifically the ones which had rebelled. But Reconstruction affected both the North and West. For this, historian Elliot West calls larger geographic inclusion Greater Reconstruction, as the U.S. over this period sought to define who was included or excluded in U.S. nationhood by their race. But the most prominent historian on Reconstruction is Eric Foner, who called it America's Unfinished Revolution. For to him, it was a debate between whether states had the right to discriminate against their own citizens, or did citizens have civil rights that states could not breach? Civil rights are about people avoiding lawful discrimination, such as segregation and prejudice, while states' rights are about what a government is allowed to do. These two concepts often come into conflict with one another. This became particularly prominent for the rebel states who had to negotiate their way back into the Union. For after all, readmission to the Union meant that southern states would be able to post their own congressmen and vote for president. How they would be readmitted hinged on this question of civil rights. As the control of what it meant to be reconstructed moved from the presidency's definition to Congress's, it also moved from a state's right to rejoin the Union into a broader fight for civil rights. But in the North and West, labor itself became interwoven into this question of civil versus states' rights. And the people who came to power during the Civil War was the Republican Party, who had initially campaigned specifically on freeing labor in the North and West, keeping the territories free of slavery, and expanding a liberal regime across the continent. But due to Reconstruction, Republicans lost that revolutionary fervor, for while there were always moderates in the party, the troubles of Reconstruction badly fractured it, losing any sense of cohesion, eventually leading to the Democrats, who were indeed the conservative party of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, taking up the mantle of reform, eventually leading to a 20th century switch in the parties, for now the Democrats are far more liberal than their Republican adversaries, which was quite the opposite of the 1860s and 70s. But following the Civil War, Republicans were the dominant party of the North, and Democrats for a time were associated with the South's deeply reactionary purposes. Reactionary means to be so deeply conservative that they oppose any kind of social liberalization, such as civil rights, in order to bring back a supposedly better state of society which previously existed. Democrats sought to redeem the South to its antebellum glory days, antebellum meaning before the war. They opposed any civil rights achieved during this time. The so-called Southern values these redeemers pursued was ultimately that of white supremacy. For a time, blacks in the South managed to keep Republican liberalism in power, but by the end of Reconstruction, Redeemer Democrats took hold, controlling the solid South with their conservative and reactionary politics for another century. Lincoln himself was much less radical than most people realize. Though he had his radical sympathies, the Republican Party choosing him in 1860 was specifically for a more moderate voice compared to their previous candidate of only 4 years prior. So when it came to Reconstruction, he sided with states' rights, trying to make an easy reinstatement for Southern states to come back into the Union. At his second inaugural speech, he said, "Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgment of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." Despite this harsher-sounding rhetoric, Lincoln's actual Reconstruction sought to end slavery, but nothing further, thereby only pushing for reunification. As early as 1862, he began placing military governors over rebel states until they could rejoin the Union. In fact, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, was originally military governor of Tennessee before becoming vice president in 1864. In 1863, Lincoln revealed his 10% plan, which required 10% of men from a rebel state to take what was called the Ironclad Oath. This oath read, "I do solemnly swear or affirm that I have never voluntarily borne arms against the United States since I have been a citizen thereof, that I have voluntarily given no aid, countenance, counsel, or encouragement to persons engaged in armed hostility thereto, that I have neither sought nor accepted nor attempted to exercise the functions of any office whatever, under any authority or pretended authority in hostility to the United States, that I have not yielded a voluntary support to any pretended government, authority, power, or constitution within the United States, hostile or inimical thereto. And I do further swear, or affirm, that to the best of my knowledge and ability, I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of office on which I am about to enter, so help me God." To Southern chivalry, this was essentially denouncing that the Confederacy had ever even existed in any legal form, denouncing its legitimacy altogether. Congress, in fact, attempted to raise that 10% limit all the way to 51% with the Wade-Davis bill in 1864, though Lincoln vetoed it. He thought 10% of a state was onerous enough. For a state to become part of the Union again, he also required that they follow through with emancipation and ratify the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery in the United States. The Confiscation Acts of 1861 and 62 had allowed him to confiscate slaves as contraband from the rebels, leading to the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation. By 1865, the passage of the 13th Amendment was guaranteed and ratification just around the corner. This essentially extended Reconstruction into the border states in the West, where slavery had remained legal all the way until 1865. In fact, other forms of coerced labor in the West had to be outlawed by bills such as the Anti-Peonage Act of 1867. Finally, the last part of Lincoln's Reconstruction was the establishment of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, known simply as the Freedmen's Bureau. It administered programs to help newly freed slaves through grants, land, school, employment negotiations, and bringing families back together. On June 21, 1866, the Southern Homestead Act was passed, which allowed the distribution of small plots of southern land to freedmen. Many northern women traveled to the South in order to teach at these freedmen's schools, while evangelizing their faith to the former slaves. But after Lincoln's assassination in 1865, Reconstruction fell on his vice president, Andrew Johnson. He was a Southern Democrat who had remained loyal despite being from Tennessee. Lincoln had chosen him as a running mate in order to create a fusion ticket, not comprehending that he would be handing Reconstruction to Johnson after his death. But Johnson in fact took a harsher approach than Lincoln's, which is rather ironic given that the radical Republicans in Congress constantly denounced him for being too easy on the South. Given that Democrats were the mainstay behind secession, radical Republicans blamed Johnson for attempting to gain power through their support. But the main thing Johnson wanted from his Reconstruction was for states to officially renounce secession, as not only wrongful, but as though it had never been countenanced whatsoever. He wanted their legislatures to pass these specific statements. The Supreme Court eventually ruled it anyways with Texas v. White, which decided in 1869 that unilateral secession was unconstitutional, given the Articles of Confederation had stated that it would be perpetual union, and the preamble of the 1787 Constitution, for which we still have as the law of the land, specifically stated it was created to form a more perfect union. Beyond that, new territories had been formed under the Northwest Ordinance, which in early versions specified that territories shall not be relinquished without congressional approval. Lincoln had in fact in 1860 specifically stated these arguments against the legality of secession, and the 1869 Texas v. White decision cemented that interpretation. But Johnson also focused on individuals. He maintained that ironclad oath, but simplified it, making people say, "I do solemnly swear or affirm, in the presence of Almighty God, that I will henceforth faithfully support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Union of the States thereunder, and that I will, in like manner, abide by and faithfully support all laws and proclamations which have been made during the existing rebellion with reference to the emancipation of slaves, so help me God." Lincoln had in fact been willing to pardon and make huge exceptions from taking this ironclad oath. But Johnson officially exempted all Confederate leaders. He still individually pardoned most Confederate leaders, with the implicit meaning that they no longer serve in government. But this was after the failure of the ironclad oath to reach 10% in many states. The only Confederate to be executed was a captain in charge of the Andersonville prisoner of war camp, though the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, was held in a military prison for 2 years. Another pledge that Johnson wanted in order to bring states back into the Union was a pledge for black political rights, but he set up no means of enforcing it, ultimately allowing states to figure that out themselves and eventually deny voting rights. In fact, he was not even willing to apply this rule to the North and West, so the South was free of actual obligation. He only required the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Finally, he wanted legal renouncements of the Confederacy's debt and secession. Of course, the Confederacy had ran up a great bill of debt in its insurrectionary war, so Johnson would not allow states to be readmitted unless they passed bills stating secession was unconstitutional and all debts incurred during the war were illegal. Despite this kind of reconciliation, though Johnson's was a little bit harsher than Lincoln's, the South proved itself unrepentant. Beginning in 1866 with Mississippi, they passed legislation that was called Black Codes. This essentially reworked the slave statutes from before the war to apply to all black people, with extra malicious clauses such as vagrancy laws, which allowed Southern law enforcement to pick up black people who were deemed to be too idle and jail them. since it was a common practice to lease convicts for manual labor. Combining vagrancy laws and convict leasing made for what many interpreted as a new form of slavery. Even before the Black Codes could be passed, Congress was particularly angry with Johnson's presidential Reconstruction. Upon assuming office, it appointed provisional governors over the rebel states and allowed them to send congressmen, which ended up including numerous ex-Confederate leaders. On the 5th of December 1865, Congress barred all ex-Confederates from being seated. So with the Black Codes, Congress saw Reconstruction as a failure. But the ignition point for their displeasure were two race riots in Tennessee and New Orleans, which are perhaps better termed as race massacres. In May of 1866, black Union veterans in Memphis, Tennessee, got in a minor shootout with white police, who instead of doing their job as police officers, joined with white crowds in massacring blacks in retaliation. Of the 48 people dead, only 2 were white. Later on that year, in July, black and white Republicans were attempting to create a new Louisiana Constitution, but were set upon by white supremacist crowds, massacring another 48, 44 of which were black. These kinds of race riots, or massacres, persisted well into the 1920s, but these two initial 1866 massacres were seen as especially Johnson's fault. His Reconstruction was a failure, and he became increasingly at odds with Congress. For Congress was primarily Republicans while Johnson was a Democrat. And while not all Republicans were radicals, almost all were opposed to Johnson's lackluster Reconstruction, so they tried to push him legislatively. The first conflict came in February of 1866, when it came time to renew the Freedmen Bureau's funding. Johnson claimed that federal funding of such a bureau was unconstitutional, that the federal government specifically did not have the power to create social programs. Congress could not gather enough votes to override his veto, so the Freedmen's Bureau did not receive renewed funding, though it continued to function with diminished resources until 1872 when it ran out of money. Concerned about the Black Codes in the South, the Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. But Johnson thought that federal civil rights infringed on states' rights, so on March 27th, he vetoed the bill. But this time, Congress gathered enough votes to override his veto a couple weeks later. Civil rights could now be federally enforced. But Johnson didn't want to enforce it. After all, he had vetoed the bill. He thought that states had the right to decide what civil rights were within their borders, since the South was still occupied in 1866, so he started angling to remove the Secretary of War, who was ultimately in charge of enforcing civil rights. In February of 1867, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, which required the Senate's approval on all presidential removals. So the Secretary of War was protected by this, though the bill was likely extremely unconstitutional. Johnson once again vetoed this in March of 1867, but Congress was ready and overrode his veto the same day. As though the Republicans were at odds enough with Johnson, they in fact recognized the constitutional arguments he was making, so they overrode those concerns by passing the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. In June of 1866, Congress sent it out for ratification, becoming a key component of Southern states being readmitted to the Union. It gave all citizens civil rights, though it was not fully adopted until July of 1868. In its first section, it blatantly said, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States, and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Under the 14th Amendment, discrimination was unconstitutional, but state and local governments would come up with creative ways of getting around this, by claiming that their laws were colorblind, and therefore non-discriminatory, despite being anything but that. The rest of the amendment sections had to do with the apportionment of congressional representation, the denial of office for those who had led the insurrection, and the denial of Confederate debt or any remuneration for slaveholders losing their slaves, specifically stating that all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. there was a clear and public split between Andrew Johnson and the Republican Congress. So Johnson went on a speaking tour in 1866 in order to gather public support from moderates during the midterm elections. It was known as the swing around the circle, but it ended up doing him more harm than good. At one point he compared himself to Christ, and in every speech he was heckled the entire way. One of the hecklers called for the hanging of Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy who was still in military prison. Johnson angrily replied, "Why don't you hang Thad Stevens and Wendell Phillips, who were two of the leading radical Republicans?" A president calling for the hanging of his political rivals, especially when falsely equating them to an insurrectionary leader, was certainly not an endearing quality of this tour. So he curried no favor with the swing around the circle. So when he returned, further drama stoked over the Secretary of War, since Johnson did not want to enforce civil rights on the states. The Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, wanted to use military force to prevent further race riots, but Johnson thought that was too much of an infringement on state rights. While Congress was in recess, he put Stanton on leave and made Ulysses S. Grant temporary Secretary of War. On August 12, 1867, he officially sent a note to Edwin Stanton saying that he had been fired. But in January of 1868, Congress officially reinstated Stanton. A month and a half later, Johnson was trying to fire Stanton again, who refused to leave his physical office, actually barricading it for 3 days while the Senate voted on whether or not to fire him. Instead of allowing these shenanigans to go any further, the House passed articles of impeachment, the first time in American history, at least for the president. The articles themselves focused on Johnson's failure to adhere to the Tenure of Office Act, but obviously there was something much deeper to them. In March 1868, the Senate had a quick trial, but they were one vote off from the required 2/3 to convict him. That one vote being radical Republican Edmund G. Ross, who thought that convicting a sitting president, regardless of his wrongdoing, would lead the United States back into civil war. So Johnson remained president, but he had to abide by military Reconstruction, which Congress quickly began passing legislation in order to create their own form of Reconstruction. Though this time is often phrased as radical Reconstruction, Congressional Republicans were mostly moderates. But to a nation recently riven by a civil war, trying to push any kind of civil rights seemed radical. With Congress deciding the policy, it was a balancing act between the vocal radicals and the moderate majority. In the midst of all the troubles of Johnson not enforcing Reconstruction and trying to remove Stanton, Congress began passing a series of military Reconstruction acts, starting in March of 1867. The Army was given specific powers in the South, including the ability to remove local officials, enforce civil rights, and protect the power to vote. This also required former rebel states to ratify the 14th Amendment in order to be readmitted into the Union, thereby gaining the ability to vote for president and send members of Congress, which in turn meant that military governance could be pulled back. Given Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee, that state was exempted because it was the only one, before Congressional Reconstruction began, that had gained readmission into the Union. For the rest of the South, this military presence was pitifully weak. They were vastly outnumbered in all situations. Most of the Union Army had been disbanded almost immediately after the war, so only a meager few remained to enforce Reconstruction. And they had a nasty enemy to fight indeed. Beginning in 1866, the Ku Klux Klan arose. They actually started off as a theater troupe, but quickly morphed into a paramilitary arm of the Democrats. They sought to intimidate Republicans to keep them from voting. Blacks tended to vote Republican, so they were especially targeted, but there were also what they called scalawags and carpetbaggers. Scalawags were Southerners who voted Republican, and carpetbaggers was a euphemism for Republicans who came south supposedly with a carpetbag full of money in order to take advantage of the Southern economy. In reality, the term was simply applied to anyone coming from the North. The first Ku Klux Klan was essentially a terrorist organization. They dressed up in gaudy costumes and rode around on horses attacking any of those three things in an effort to bring back the antebellum South's ways. They were trying to make the South into a Democrat stronghold, preventing Republicans from imposing their liberal ideas of civil rights. But by 1868, with the presidential election that very year, 7 of the 13 Confederate states were back in the Union, and despite the KKK trying to intimidate voters, Republicans swept the election, bringing Ulysses S. Grant to the presidency. Republicans praised him as a radical, the only president in our history to accept that label. And though white supremacist intimidation would eventually bring the Democrats to power in the South, Republicans overall remained mostly dominant all the way until 1932. From Andrew Johnson to Woodrow Wilson, as in 1869 to 1913, there was only one Democrat president who served 2 non-consecutive terms. Nationally, the Republicans remained dominant, and in the South, they remained so throughout most of Reconstruction. Buoyed by these victories, Republicans pushed voting rights, not just civil rights, so they passed the 15th Amendment in February of 1869. A year later, it was ratified, and it specifically stated, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Voting rights were now enshrined in the Constitution. With the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Military Reconstruction Acts, the Civil Rights Acts, and Republican dominance, it seemed like there was a bright future ready for the freemen. And to crown all of this, in May of 1870, Congress passed a means to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, allowing the U.S. Army to root out the Ku Klux Klan after they had interfered with the 1868 election. As soon as the Enforcement Act became effective in 1871, the Army went to work arresting anyone associated with the KKK. Former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who had become the Grand Wizard of the KKK, as in their leader, in 1869, claimed that there were 550,000 members throughout the South, and that they would send an army of 40,000 to Washington, D.C. But that never materialized, and he officially disbanded the Klan in 1872. And despite huge amounts of arrests, there were very few convictions. The first Klan was defeated. Though they would rematerialize in 1915, the KKK did not exist for over 40 years. Despite all of these accomplishments, the Democrats were making steady headway in the South. Every state had gained readmission by 1870, which meant that there was no more military governance save to enforce civil rights and voting rights. And the Republicans steadily lost ground in the South as well. Beginning in Tennessee in 1869, Democrats steadily took over the South, creating a stronghold that would last for a century. It was called the Solid South. The last holdouts were South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, who managed to maintain Republican governance all the way until 1877, at the end of Reconstruction. For Americans in the North and West were getting tired of all this expenditure to try to enforce voting rights and civil rights. Especially in the West, Reconstruction measures failed in the field. President Grant had created what he called a peace policy, which made reservations for the various tribes, but keeping them on those reservations became quite the task for the military. The ultimate downfall of his peace policy came in 1876, just as the country was celebrating its centennial anniversary. A major battle out in the hills of South Dakota led to what's called Custer's Last Stand at Little Bighorn, where Lakotas who refused to be relegated to ever-shrinking reservations defeated the 7th Cavalry in open battle. The peace policy was supposed to end the Indian Wars, but had only served to make tribes more desperate for their own sovereignty, which would be wiped out completely after Reconstruction with the assimilation policy that eventually replaced Grant's failed peace policy. To have it happen during America's centennial was a national embarrassment, where the army couldn't even keep the tribes on the land despite having overwhelming force. Western Reconstruction also included attacks on polygamy in Utah. The Mormon Church refused to end it, despite the 1862 Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act, which tried to outlaw polygamy with fines, and Grant had to gain even more power through the Poland Act of 1874 to bring further prosecution. This failed miserably, and it wouldn't be until 1890 that the Mormon Church would renounce polygamy. Southeast of Utah, there was the Anti-Peonage Act, which not only tried to stop peonage in New Mexico, but the Indian slavery system that had existed there for centuries. Here was one of the great successes of Reconstruction, for both peons and Indian slaves were in fact freed. Even California saw a bit of Reconstruction after they removed what was called Indian apprenticeships, but were basically a form of forced indentured servitude, which became illegal in 1863. But the reservation system would remain a point of hot contention well into the present day. Throughout the 1870s, Republicans had to maintain this bulwark to keep Reconstruction funded. Radical Republicans would make overblown claims about the need to take revenge on the South, and they'd talk about the Union dead, constantly reminding everyone of how nasty the war had been. This was called waving the bloody shirt, and the American people grew quite tired of it. In fact, radical Republicans became such anathema to so many moderates that for the 1872 election, a group of Republicans formed a new party called the Liberal Republicans. That year, the staunch Republican Horace Greeley, who had done so much to advance the Republican cause in the 1850s and 60s, ran as a liberal Republican against the radical Ulysses S. Grant. But the Liberal Republicans lost, and Grant gained a second term. But his second term was fairly ignominious. He was able to stop the Klan, but numerous other groups rose in their stead. They had to be more covert than the Klan, so they organized as political factions that would secretly go out and menace people under the cover of darkness. These groups, like the White League and the Red Shirts, essentially just replaced the Klan, and due to their more covert structure, the Enforcement Act was nigh impossible to use against them. These groups were as silly as what were called saber and horse clubs, where they'd claim to be going out playing baseball while mounted on a horse with a saber. It was all done with a wink and a nod, but through their suppressive violence, they were able to make the solid South a Democrat stronghold. Throughout Reconstruction, there'd been several more racial massacres, but in the later years, newspapers acted as though both sides were equally to blame, thereby mitigating national outrage and consoling the nation that the South was just fine. The Solid South only came into being through white supremacists shedding hundreds of black people's blood. Democrats eliminated Republican interest through intimidation, but they had trouble while the Army technically still had the power to stop the White League and their ilk. Army personnel dwindled steadily to the point of basically being completely ineffectual after 1874, but the White League, Red Shirts, and others couldn't operate openly while a meager few soldiers remained. In 1876, the worst voter fraud in U.S. history was perpetrated by these groups. To replace the antebellum Southern Democrats, and to maintain a veneer of legitimacy, resurgent Democrats of the 1870s tried to redeem the South by coming back to power and restoring antebellum greatness, with the explicit plan of removing all of these civil rights and restoring white supremacy, though they didn't succeed until after Reconstruction. Along with them, they brought the lost cause myth to legitimize their power. They eulogized the Confederacy for 4 core falsehoods. They said that slavery was good for the slave. The Civil War itself was not about slavery, and in fact it was a war of northern aggression, and that Reconstruction was meant to harm the South. This pernicious myth still undergirds a lot of racism to the present, and Redeemer Democrats used it to gain power. Of course, the US had a far more simple reason to want to end Reconstruction. Beginning in 1873, a major economic depression began, and it lasted for 7 years. This long depression was probably from the aftermath of the Civil War, but it made Republican control precarious. Nobody wanted to waste money in the midst of a deepening depression. In fact, it was so bad that in 1874, Democrats managed to gain a majority in the House of Representatives, and they managed to do so in the Senate in 1878. It didn't help that Grant was probably our most scandal-ridden president until recent times. Officials within his administration were misusing power everywhere they could. There was a gold panic right at the beginning of his presidency that his officials used to gain a great deal of money. An appointment to a New York customs house in 1871 ended up with embezzlement. Throughout the 70s, postal routes were given to people as a form of cronyism. Especially prominent were the star routes, which were supposed to be especially arduous routes. These crony appointments were so bad that many of them refused to even do the routes. And despite all of this malfeasance, prosecutions were rare, if ever. In 1873, Grant managed to get the largest salary boost of any president to that time. It was known as the salary grab. 2 years later, the Attorney General was found to be taking bribes to avoid prosecution. That same year, a ring of tax collectors were shown to be embezzling whiskey taxes. And finally, in 1876, Custer's last stand embarrassed the administration on a military level. And there were so many other scandals. Trust in Republican control simply wasn't there. So the election of 1876 seemed to be perfectly poised to bring a Democrat president. The candidate that year, Samuel Tilden, had openly suggested fighting another civil war during the campaign. And despite everything seeming poised in the Democrats' favor, the election was too close to call, and so got thrown into the House of Representatives. Some sort of corrupt bargain was struck by this election commission to get the Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, to gain the presidency, despite Tilden gaining 3% more of the popular vote. But in order to give Hayes the presidency, the Republicans had given up on Reconstruction. They agreed to withdraw the military from the South, and then cemented that the military could no longer be used to enforce civil rights like they had through the Posse Comitatus Act, which outlawed the military from forming posses and being used as a police force, with only 2 exceptions, when an insurrection is declared or martial law. The Redeemer Democrats cemented the Solid South in their control. It would take some time for them to dismantle all the civil rights gains of Reconstruction, but without the military to police it, a new era was on its way. The Supreme Court invalidated a great deal of civil rights through a number of cases in the 1880s, and eventually many states passed what were called Jim Crow laws, which mostly were passed in the 1890s, legalizing disenfranchisement from the vote, the segregation of races, and discriminatory laws against non-white people, and these laws were especially prevalent in the South. So while the North had won the war, the South won the peace.